Welcome back to Scholarly Writing and Publication. I'm Dr. Sam Gannon, and you're here for Session 3, Timeline and Scope of Work. In this session, we have 3 segments. The first segment will deal with planning, how to plan for your scholarly work. Once you've targeted a journal, you know your topic, you've done the research, you're ready to go. What planning steps do you need to put in place before you put pen to paper or before you start typing away? In the second segment, we'll talk about scope of work. What are the things that you need to include? Where are the areas where you need to focus and considerations that you need to make? And then lastly, we'll talk about a timeline. Hopefully, you don't just start writing and finish whenever you get finished. You have a kind of a plan in mind, of a deadline, of when you want to have deliverables or when you want to achieve certain milestones. So we'll talk about all 3 of those. But in this segment, we're going to talk about planning. So, question for you. How often do you conduct a literature review? Do you only conduct a literature at the beginning of your research, but maybe even before you start conducting experiments? Are you constantly immersed in the research from start to finish, or are you selectively engaged at certain points? I'm going to suggest that during this planning phase, once you've targeted your journal, once you know your topic or you've conducted your research, that you go back and do a literature review at this point. Even a cursory literature review can help you identify gaps. It can strengthen your writing, can show you what's going on in the field or in the discipline that you can then hammer in on and focus on. If there are some contradictions or some new data out there, you can discuss that. You want to be as current as possible. So here's some considerations when you're doing a literature review, whether it be the beginning literature review at the beginning of your research, at the outset of the work that you're doing, or whether it be at the very end. Later on, after you've written everything, you're just going to do one last check through to make sure you've gotten everything just right. Here's some considerations in literature reviews. You want to make sure you've got good queries, that you're using good keywords, that you've also approaching the right databases. Hopefully you're using multiple databases and not just going to one source. You're approaching it from many different aspects. And then lastly, that your approach is pretty sound, that you're trying to be thoughtful about how you're approaching it, that you're using a scientific approach, if you will, as you conduct your literature review. So let's begin by looking with query, keywords, and databases. So queries, as we know, can take many various shapes and forms. The thing that I want to remind to you is something called PICOS, P-I-C-O-S. It lets us know that we need to include the population that we're studying in our query. We want to include the intervention that we're using, the comparison, if there is one, the outcome, if we know it, and the study design, which we should have in hand. Those are 5 elements that you might want to include in your query. Also with keywords, you want to be sure you're thinking about similar terms. Maybe even if they have a slightly different meaning, could someone use it in that way? Are there synonyms that are important that you could be using, especially when looking at historical or changes over time longitudinal data? Variations. Are there different variations of the same word or of the same term, or do different disciplines use different terms for the same word differently? So you want to think about that. Are you using both common words and technical words to find what you're looking for? Are you looking at alternate spellings, because different forms of English, say, have different spellings of certain words? And then also I want to alert you to some indexes have prearranged titles and headings and keywords that they use that could be helpful. So if you've got that list from the journal or the discipline or the field, you can use that as kind of a guide or a guide to helping you find the right keywords. Next, just a few of the online databases that are out there and available within the sciences that could be helpful for you as you're going through and looking for articles and literature that you can cite and be aware of and be familiar with, maybe even argue with in your own work. In terms of managing references, there are several free options as well as some that you have to pay for. These are 5 of the more common options that folks use in managing their references, in addition to the old standard paper and pen or index card or keeping track of them on a list on your computer. These are some nice and easy ways that people manage them that kind of help them stay organized and complete. Let's talk about good notes. Hopefully you're going through and making notes as you're doing your outline, as you're planning your project. So some things that good notes have in common is that they're accurate. You've checked it, you've made sure that you're citing it or quoting it exactly correct. You've got the right numbers. You're not transposing anything. That when you're writing, you're using good vocabulary. You're using the correct terminology. All of those things. You want your notes to be as accurate as possible. This is the basis for your article. So you want to have that. You want to complete your due diligence to make sure it's correct. Next, you want them to be organized. You want to be able to take those good notes and put them in some order. Whether you're using an index card system or a slide system on a PowerPoint, whatever you're using, you want it to be an organized method so that you can quickly begin to write based on the notes that you've taken. Next, you want to distinguish between notes that are direct quotes, notes that are paraphrased, and notes that are close quotes. Remember in our last session we talked about close quotes, and that does constitute plagiarism. So you want to be sure that if it's a close quote that maybe you need to distinguish it a little bit more from the original source and use some of those guidelines that we talked about in session 2 to help you do that. And then lastly, you want to make sure it's complete. There's nothing like trying to write an article and then realizing that you need to go back to the source material because your notes are not accurate, because your notes are not complete, your notes are not effective in helping you write, that you actually need to go back to the source data. And you may have already returned that book to the library, you may have closed that document or put that file away, or you may be writing from a different location where you don't have access to that original source document. So you want to make sure that your notes are complete. And then lastly, let's talk about the use of consultants. At some point during the planning process, it may behoove you to reach out to someone with expertise in one or more areas that can be helpful to you in putting together your writing and assembling it. Maybe it's someone with a special expertise in data analysis. Maybe it's someone with qualitative analysis and coding. You might find an additional resource helpful. This person could also help you establish a foundation. They could be an expert in the field that could then be added to your paper as a writer or an author and could really help solidify that inside the framework of a new discipline or a different area than you're normally used to publishing in or normally used to reading in, that you're really not an expert in. But a statistician could be helpful there. And then lastly, some sponsors and some journals require that if you're submitting tables and charts with data attached to them, that you have used a statistician, that you have talked to a biostatistician or someone with expertise, that they can then sign off on it and say, yes, this data is legitimate, yes, these tables are accurate, all of those pieces. So you definitely want to be checking with your sponsor and or your journal to make sure that they don't require the use of a consultant for certain aspects of your study. So, those are some considerations for the planning stage. I'm sure you can think of more of those. If you do, please email me and let me know. I'd love to add them and update this presentation so it's as useful and helpful as it possibly can be. Thank you so much and good luck with your publication.